Okay, so it's 10:59. We'll give it another minute. How's everybody doing today? Good?
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, it is 11 o'clock. Is everybody ready to go? Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. Awesome. So can you see me? I'm trying to look directly at the camera, but I'm not going to do that for the most part. I'm just going to look at my screen because I'm going to be sharing my screen. And that way you can see all the documents we're talking about. So today's class is called 50 Ways to Leave Your Contract. And I usually play some background music. I didn't get that queued up today, but 50 Ways to Leave Your Contract. Not exactly 50. Does anybody want to guess how many there are? And we're talking about like in the as-is contract plus all the addenda. And then in the we have a different number if we're going through the standard contract plus all the addenda. So anybody want to guess how many ways?
Is there more?
Well, it's a guess. The question is more or less than 50, and it's a guess. So what do you think?
I will say they're less.
Less? Okay, less than 50. Anybody else want to guess? No? Okay. So I counted up again this morning just to make sure. And my last count, including the as-is contract and all the addenda, 46 ways that one party or the other could potentially get out of the contract for one reason or another. And if we're counting in the standard contract, we have 48 ways. And that would include all the addenda as well. So not quite 50, but it's a catchier title than 48 ways to leave your contract, right? So there we go. I'm going to share the as-is contract, and I'm just going to go through very quickly and point out all of those places to you so that you can see every place where one party or another has the potential to leave the contract. And then we'll do the same thing with each of the addenda. All right. So, and I didn't introduce myself. I think everybody knows me by now. I've been here a few times, I think now. Just in case, I'm Sallie Wagner, and I work with Murray Coleman. He and I are working with your office now to provide broker and compliance support. We do broker on call, we answer questions, whatever you need to help you with a transaction, we'll do our best to help you. So let me share my screen and we're going to get going with this. And I am going to put on my glasses so I can see better what I'm doing. All right, here we go. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? And right now it should say as is residential contract for sale and purchase. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
All right. So the first place we are going to look at, and this is sort of a little bit of a cheat, but not really, because 50 ways to leave your contract, right? The first way is at paragraph 3A. And at this point, it's not really a contract, but we're going to say this is one way that we can leave the contract. All right. And this is if the seller does not respond before the time for acceptance. All right. And so think of that as the expiration date for the offer. And if I make the offer and I say that the time for acceptance is noon tomorrow, if I don't hear from you as the seller by noon tomorrow, that offer is dead. It's like a little caterpillar that got smushed and it's never going to become a big, beautiful butterfly of a contract, right? It is dead, does not exist. Now, of course, yes,
I'm sorry.
no, go right ahead.
What about if they didn't answer because they have multiple offers and they answer like an hour later and they choose that one? Do they
Okay,
need to change?
so here's the question. The question is, what if they respond later after the time for acceptance has passed and they want to accept at that point? So at that point, it's entirely up to the buyer whether they want to allow the seller to accept after the time for acceptance has passed. They're not required to. And if they do decide to accept after that, yes, the best practice would be change that time for acceptance so that we know the parties agreed that it was okay for the seller to respond after the time. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So now here's a catch to that, because time for acceptance, well, in the real world, you rarely get an acceptance the first time around, right? The seller has three potential ways to respond. They can accept, which is rare. They can reject, which is rare. Most likely they're going to counter offer, right? They're going to come back with other terms. So if you look at the last line of paragraph A, it tells us about our time frame for what happens when the seller counters the offer, or if the seller counters and then the buyer counters back, right? And so what it says is, unless otherwise stated, the time for acceptance of counter offers is 2 days after the date the counter offer is delivered. So imagine real world, you submit an offer to me and you say time for acceptance is noon tomorrow. So at 11:59 a.m., I send you a counter offer. Okay, so I have it accepted, but I have responded within the time period that you gave me. What the contract tells us, unless I tell you otherwise, then we have 2 days to consider that counter offer. Okay, if the party does not respond within the 2-day time period, then we would consider that that counter offer is dead and we're no longer in negotiations. All right. The reality is sometimes those times pass and people continue to negotiate, and that's okay as long as everybody agrees to it. But the parties are not required to continue to negotiate after the time periods have passed.
So if I said, okay, until tomorrow at noon, and the people responded today,
That's okay.
so do they still have 2 days from today or from
2 days.
tomorrow?
2 days from today. So the question was, I get an offer and the time for acceptance is noon tomorrow, but I respond back today with a counter offer. The 2-day period starts today when I respond back with the counter offer. It doesn't start tomorrow at the end of the time for acceptance.
Okay,
So the contract says 2 days after the date the counter offer is delivered. So we're always going to start that 2-day period from delivery of the counter offer to the other party. Good question. All right. So are we good with that? All right. So I'm going to scroll down to the next one. And the next one is going to be in paragraph 6B. And this is when the property is going to be subject to a lease. That means it's going to be occupied post-closing by third-party tenants, right? And so what it says is that within 5 days after the effective date, the seller must deliver copies of those leases to the buyer. And then the buyer has 5 days to examine those leases. If the buyer determines in that 5-day period, buyer's sole discretion, that's what it says, right? Buyer's sole discretion at line 71, then the buyer can terminate the contract. Okay, so this is separate from any inspection period that may be going on.
okay, so for an example, for an
Oh.
example,
Thank you.
if I'm having, I'm selling, I'm the buyer saying, and I have a property that has 2 renters.
Mhm.
So I have 5 days to get to my buyer, those leases.
Yes,
And this is after negotiation and after
Uh-huh,
everything is
yeah,
in the contract.
yes, after we have the contract.
And if he doesn't like those contracts, he can terminate it.
Yes.
Without it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So the question is, if I have a property that has like a duplex or something, 2 tenants, the seller has 5 days after the effective date within that time period to deliver copies of those leases to the buyer. The buyer has absolute right to terminate for any reason or no reason at all within that 5-day period after they get the leases, okay? After they get the leases. So if seller provides the leases on day 1 after the effective date, then the buyer has 5 days from then, okay? And remember, when we count time periods, the day of delivery is always day 0. And we count forward from there. So if I get the leases today, then I have 5 days to review and give her seller notice about if I want to terminate. So if I get it today, day 0, so Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is my 5-day period. So by Wednesday, I need to tell you if I'm going to terminate. Okay. And so when I do the critical dates class, we go into detail about counting time periods, but we're going through this pretty quickly so I can show you all the points where things can go wrong, if you will. And the next one is in paragraph 8, and it's the very bottom of the page, line 108, terminate this contract. So let's read before what happens to find out where we get to that point. So we're going to start at line 104. So picture it. We're within the loan approval period. And it says, if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period, because it says prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, right? So we're still within that time period, whatever it may be. Then buyer may provide written notice to the seller stating this: I'm going to waive loan approval and I'm still going to buy the property even though I didn't get approved, or I'm going to terminate the contract. Okay, so those are the buyer's options if the buyer does not get loan approval within the loan approval period. Yes.
So the loan approval, we normally choose the 30 days.
Right.
Because it's kind of a.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the default.
And maybe right now we can put it a little bit more because
Yeah,
market, crazy market. But if in day number 30, it's not approved, they can either do either or.
yes, yes. So the question is, if the loan approval period is 30 days and we're day 30, the buyer still has the right to give one of those notice if they don't have loan approval yet. Now, at line 103, it says, upon obtaining loan approval, the buyer will promptly deliver written notice to the seller. So what that tells us is within the loan approval period, the buyer needs to give one of 3 notices. The first one is, yay, I got loan approval. The second one is, I didn't get loan approval, but I'm still going to go forward. And then the third option is, I didn't get loan approval and I'm terminating the contract. So the buyer must, absolutely must, give one of those 3 notices within the loan approval period. And here's what happens if they don't. This is one of the rare instances where the seller has the right to terminate. And if you look at line, let's see, 112, right in there, okay? If the buyer fails to deliver the notice as required, and that's the notice we just talked about, one of those 3 notices, then seller, within 3 days after the end of the loan approval period, has the option to terminate the contract. Did everybody know about that? I have heard heartbreaking tales about sellers using this as a strategic strike to get rid of a buyer because they had a backup contract and they preferred that one. A couple years ago, an agent was working with a buyer. The buyer was approved. The agent slash buyer didn't give notice of loan approval within the loan approval period. Boom. 12:01 a.m., the day after the end of the loan approval period, the seller gives notice to terminate the contract. And there was absolutely nothing that the buyer or the buyer's agent could do about it because it's permitted by the contract. So make sure the buyer gives that required notice before the end of the loan approval period.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you're given that loan approval, it doesn't have to come from the bank?
No, the
Okay.
contract says the buyer must give notice. And we've even had instances where the lender jumped the gun and told the seller, yay, we got loan approval. And then there were changed circumstances that the lender didn't know about yet. When the buyer told the lender said, oh, we deny the loan. And then the buyer gave notice that they didn't get loan approval. The seller tried to argue, but the lender already told us. And the contract says the buyer must give it. So
Okay.
it's not something that comes from the lender, it comes from the buyer.
But you should be in contact with the lender to make sure everything's moving smoothly, but it's really, but I've said that to a buyer before and they'll say, well, how do I know, that I'm going to get the loan? How do you explain that? I mean, because
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of
Everything's-
an amorphous concept really under the contract because we don't point to a specific document to say, yes, that's loan approval. And that's why it's important, as you said, to have contact with the lender to understand how the loan is progressing so that you know to give the right notice. Okay, so the next one is kind of on the lender, and this is beginning at line 116 to down around line 122. So this is if loan approval has been obtained or deemed to have been obtained, because if the buyer doesn't give the right notice, then we just assume that loan approval is there and we've waived that contingency, right? So that's kind of how that happens. And the lender denies the loan under two circumstances. The first one is property related conditions. So imagine like FHA-VA loan where we have appraisal required repairs, that sort of thing. So that would be property related condition. And then the other one is at line 119 where it says the appraisal of the property is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. So this is not an appraisal contingency. This is there for the protection of the lender. And think loan to value ratios, right? Think underwriting guidelines for the lender. If the lender decides that the appraisal is insufficient to support loan to value ratios, insufficient to make it through their underwriting guidelines, and the lender denies the loan on that basis, then the contract terminates, right? And the buyer is going to get the escrow back. All right. Now we're going to move on. Is everybody good with that? So our next one is going to be in paragraph 10. And people kind of forget about paragraph 10. It's because it's in part of that flyover part of the contract where there aren't a lot of blanks to fill in. But this is the only disclosure, and I call it 10 for 10 disclosures because there are 10 disclosures in paragraph 10. This is the only disclosure where we fill in the blank. And it's at paragraph D about flood zone and elevation certification. And so it's this long involved process of if this and that, or this and that. And what it all comes down to is if the lowest elevation is below flood level, or the property is ineligible for flood insurance coverage, then the buyer may terminate the contract by giving written notice to the seller within 20 days after the effective date. So 20 days is kind of like a thumb sticking out someplace, right? We don't have anything really that counts 20 days. And so my suggestion always is, just in terms of administering the contract, as long as all the parties are on board, make that fit within your inspection period, right? So if your inspection period is 10 days, put 10 days in this blank at line 210, because that way the buyer knows that we're doing all of the due diligence within the inspection period. It's just easy to administer. So it's not required. Obviously, you can put whatever date in there the parties are willing to agree to. But just in terms of administering the contract, I think it's easier to make it coincide with your inspection period. All right, so that was number 7, in case anybody's keeping count. The next one is in paragraph 12, and this is our inspection period. And really, when we deal with the as-is contract, this is the one that most people concentrate on, right? And we don't really pay attention to all these other things that could happen to throw us out of contract. So this one is easy. We specify the number of days. The default is 15, but we can put however many days in there the parties are willing to accept. And what it says is the buyer, and if you look at the end of line 251, in buyer's sole discretion, can determine that I don't want this property anymore and I'm going to terminate the contract. Okay, buyer's sole discretion, any reason, no reason at all. And so many times the other agent, the listing agent, is like, well, you can't terminate because you didn't do inspections. We don't have to. You didn't terminate because you didn't give us a repair list. No, we don't have to. You didn't give us the inspection report. We don't have to. We don't have to have a reason. We can just wake up one morning and decide we don't like the color, or we don't like how the sun looks behind the house. I mean, it's any reason, no reason at all. And so that's the big one that we always associate with the as-is contract. However, as we're seeing, there are a lot more that could come into play. So up until this point, the as-is and the standard contract have been exactly the same in terms of these, ways to leave the contract. Here's the departure. So I'm going to quickly scroll over to the standard contract and just show you, and it's at paragraph 12. And if you remember from the comparison class, we have all of these general repairs and the wood destroying organism repairs and the permit issues. So here's where we depart from how it is in the as-is. It is possible for one party or another to terminate under the under the standard based on inspections. However, it's a much more intricate process. So let's look at how it's going to work. Now, the first one is going to be with regard to general repair items. And if you can see right here, beginning at line 300, right? So it says, if the cost of the general repairs is more than the amount that we've put in paragraph 9A, and we're talking standard contract here, right? Then the parties have some options. The seller can go, oh, don't worry about it. I'll pay for everything. How often do you think that happens? Yeah, I know. It's so cute. The other option is the buyer will say, oh, don't worry about all those other repairs. I'll just take it a la carte up to the amount of the repairs in paragraph 9A, and then I'll take the rest as is. So that's an option, right? If neither of them gives notice to the other, then either of them can terminate the contract. So it's like, who's going to blink first, right? Are you going to give notice to me? Am I going to give notice to you? If neither of us blinks, then either of us can terminate the contract. So that's how that can happen.
Within what time frame?
So it is 10 days. 5 days after receipt of the last estimate. 5 days after receipt of the last estimate at line 302. And then you see at line 306, either party may terminate the contract. So again, one of those rare instances where we let the seller have the option to terminate.
So if they can't come to an agreement,
Mhm.
then one party or the other can terminate.
Yes, absolutely, based on the cost of repairs.
So we have agents asking for the standard contract.
Mhm.
I've done it myself.
Yeah.
With $0 in the repair. That basically makes it an as is, doesn't it? So it doesn't help any? They can still walk away for any reason? No, they can't. They still have to have a home inspection.
They still have to do the inspection and the repair list needs to come back more than 0.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then if the seller's not willing to pay it and the buyer's not willing to take it as is, then either of them could terminate the contract.
I think it might just help. My focus for being in this class is to prevent
Yeah.
people from
Yeah,
leaving.
exactly.
So I think it still helps keep the buyers in a transaction.
does.
Because they're invested more. They
Yeah.
Spent money.
Exactly. Yeah, it's harder to walk away. So here's the question. If you put 0 for the repair limit in paragraph 9A, you know, it essentially it's like an as-is contract, right? Because if the repair list comes back at $1, then either party could terminate the contract. They could give notice, unless the seller goes, yeah, I'll pay $1. I don't care. The incentive, though, as she was saying, is that the buyers have to do the inspection to get to this point. And so they're more invested in the transaction. Once you've done the inspection, it's a little bit harder to walk away, right? Because you've already imagined where you're going to put stuff, right? And how you're going to fix it up. So, right,
trying to make it-
exactly.
I'm
Yeah.
Trying to get people to put $500.
Yeah, she was saying she's encouraging people to put $500. You can put whatever amount people agree to, right? And that's the point of this class, as you were saying. How can we identify all these points of exit from the contract so that we can help to prevent that exit from the contract? We want the contracts to stay together, right? We don't want people to be able to leave the contract. Because it's so hard to get into contracts these days. Okay, so our next one is very similar and it has to do with wood destroying organisms. And so imagine we're still looking at those repair limits in paragraph 9A, and the repair limit comes back more than 9A. And then it says that the buyer can deliver notice to the seller agreeing to pay the excess. So we leave it all on the buyer at this point because stigma that may be associated with a home that has wood destroying organism damage, right? So we leave it on the buyer to give that notice that I'll accept it. And if the buyer doesn't give the notice, and we're at the bottom of the page at lines 327 through 329, then either party may terminate by giving notice to the other. So you see that small little difference between this and the general repairs. General repair, either party can choose to pay. In this one, it's up to the buyer to decide. And if the buyer doesn't decide, then either party can terminate. All right, and then our next one, our next departure from the as is, this is only for the standard, obviously, it has to do with permit items. And so what this says is, and we're looking at about line 354. So again, imagine that permit limit in paragraph 9A, and the cost to address all the permit issues is more than that amount that we've put in line 9A. And so it says, and this is the same as the general repairs, seller can elect to pay all of the excess. Buyer can say, oh, don't worry, I'll just take a credit at closing for the amount that we've agreed, or nobody gives notice, either party can terminate. Okay, so, yes.
And that notice is in the time that we stipulate that is the inspection period.
No, we're beyond the inspection period at this point, theoretically. because the buyer has the inspection period to have the inspections done and deliver the reports and the request for repairs to the seller. And then the seller has 10 days to get estimates for those costs. And then the parties have 5 days. So you can see how the days add up under the standard. I mean, we could be 30 days out before we get to this point. Yeah, so that's why you really need to be very careful about plotting your dates for a standard contract, because the times add up very quickly. Okay, so that was a question about, are we still within the inspection period? And the answer is no. We could be well beyond the inspection period by the time we get to this point. So something to keep in mind with the standard. I mean, even though you want the standard contract because you feel like it's more secure, it may not be, because you may be farther into the transaction before people leave, which is even more discouraging when you get so far into it, right? Okay, so let's go back to the as-is contract now. So we talked about paragraph 12, and our next one is going to be at paragraph 15. And so this is, again, this is kind of a sneaky way into it, but this is default, right? So what we're saying is buyer default or seller default. So if buyer defaults under any of the things that they are required to perform, then the seller can go, okay, we're done. And I'm going to keep the escrow deposit as my liquidated damages. And it also says at line 329 at the top of the next page, seller may proceed in equity to enforce seller's rights. So that means is specific performance. Because in the old days of law, there were two different court systems. There was the legal remedy, and then there was the equitable remedy. So you went into a court of law or you went into a court of equity. And equity was more like, we just feel like this is the right thing to have happen, right? And specific performance was an equitable remedy. So that's why they're saying they proceed in equity. Because specific performance is when we say, when the court says, buyer, you said you were going to buy it and you are. We're going to make sure you buy it. So the seller could theoretically do that. The next one is the buyer default or the seller default. Seller fails to perform. Like seller gets to the day before closing and says, I've changed my mind. I'm not selling. Okay, so and I've heard that recently. So that's never a fun call, right? And so what happens? We say that the buyer is able to say, okay, we're terminating the contract and we're done. I'm going to get my deposit back. And it says that I, as the buyer, I have not waived my right to seek other damages. And that makes sense, right? Because my deposit was my money. And if I get it back, that really, that's just my money back. And that's not really penalizing the seller for the seller's bad behavior in defaulting under the contract. And so I can get my damages, like my costs for inspections, my costs for loan applications and all of that kind of stuff, the appraisal, any of that kind of stuff, I can go into court and seek. And I can also get specific performance. So I could say, seller, you are going to sell this house to me, and the judge is going to tell you. So those are the options for default by the party. So I've included those as ways to leave the contract, even though that really is kind of we've already left the contract in a way because one party or another failed to perform. Make sense? All right. And then our next one. So that was numbers 9 and 10, if anybody's counting. And I always have people who count. So the next one, we're going to talk about paragraph 18, title standards. So in title standards, we get title evidence, right? And then the buyer has the option to review all of that title evidence and give notice to the seller if there are any defects. And so we're gonna get that title evidence, and it says if it's financed, it's within 15 days prior to closing. If it's a cash transaction, is within 5 days prior to closing. And then buyer is going to review that. And then we're gonna let seller have some time to cure. And it says we're gonna give the seller 30 days to cure. That's our initial cure period. And if the seller is unable to cure the title defect within that time period, then we have the options to terminate the contract. So,
Both parties have option or one?
so it's the buyer who has the option.
Okay.
Yeah. So, let's go back up here. So it says, then buyer may, within 5 days after the end of the inspection period, give notice to the seller. You see, that's the last line on page 7, and then we're going over to the first line on page 8. Then buyer has some options. Buyer can extend the cure period up to 120 days. So that's a long time, right? Because we've already had a 30-day cure period. Or decide to take title as is, like, I don't care about all those defects. I don't care if you don't own the property. I'm just go ahead and give it to me. I don't care, right? Not likely to happen. Or terminate the contract, right?
What if they want to go beyond the 120 days?
They could agree to do that if they want.
Is the buyer, is the seller obligated to go past the 120 days if the buyer wants to?
They would not have to, because it says a specified period not to exceed. I mean, if the buyer says, look, I want to keep going, and the seller goes, no, I don't, there's no way, it's obvious to me this is going to take years and I'm not doing it. They would not have to agree.
Is the vacant land the same number of days?
I believe so, yes.
Sally,
Yeah.
I have a
Got
question.
one that's been-
Oops.
Yeah, it can take a long time to cure title.
I
Yes,
have
I
a
heard a
question.
question.
Yes, so if you just, so this is saying that the buyer has to give the seller 30 days. So if they don't have anywhere to live or, all those other things, it's their expense and they have, and
Yeah.
if the loan's not going through and if they've locked in, they're paying all kinds of other fees. So that the
Yeah.
buyer has to do it.
Yeah, and I've just been working with an agent in this very situation. It has to do with probate, and which would be considered a title issue, right? Because seller
Mhm.
can't deliver title yet. And so they have included all those loan extension lock-in fees as part of the cost to the seller for the buyer to agree to extend the cure period.
Okay, so you're saying you can, you have a point where you can ask them to pay for these fees? And how about hotels and moving costs?
Yeah.
Things this, that
Yeah.
in the seller would have to do it, or it had,
The seller would not have to. If the seller doesn't agree to it, then the contract would terminate.
okay, so you can terminate if
Yeah.
that doesn't, if you, so it's not something a buyer has to do, you both have to agree.
Yes.
About the
yeah,
30-day
you would both-
period.
Yeah, so there's really no wiggle room on that initial 30-day period, the
Okay,
30-day cure period. The wiggle room is the extensions
okay,
of the cure period. And so that's where the parties could negotiate for, well, reimburse me for my costs.
okay,
Okay, does that make sense?
yes,
All right. And then the next one is similar. It has to do with survey. And what it says in paragraph 18B standards is we're going to treat survey issues, meaning encroachments, in just the same way that we're going to treat other title defects. And so if there is an encroachment issue, the seller would need to cure it within the same time periods as any other title defect. And so that would lead us to the potential of, after a 30-day cure period, if we still have an encroachment issue, the buyer would have that option to terminate. The buyer could either take it as is, the buyer could extend the cure period, or the buyer could terminate the contract.
Question in there.
Uh-huh.
If there is an encroachment, the encroachment gets corrected, who has to pay for the new survey to verify that it's been corrected?
So it doesn't say that. My guess is it would be the seller, because we want to deliver evidence to the buyer satisfactory to the buyer that the defect has been cured. And so it would be up to the seller then to present that new survey, to say, look, I fixed it. You know, whatever the fix is, just to verify. Okay, so at paragraph D, this is our next one, and this is number 14. Remember in paragraph 6B when we talked about the leases? So the buyer gets another bite at that apple. And so what this says is that we've already seen the leases, and the buyer said, okay, I'm fine with the leases. Now, before closing, it says at least 10 days prior to closing, then seller is going to provide an estoppel letter, kind of like you get an estoppel letter from the HOA or the condo association or the lender, right? To give us a snapshot view of what's going on with those leases. Like, here's the lease amount, here's the escrow deposit I'm holding, here's the advance rent, here's the pet deposit, here's everything about the lease, right? And if the seller is not able to provide that estoppel letter, then the buyer can actually go talk to the tenants and verify the information that the seller has provided. And if the buyer determines that that information is not acceptable because it doesn't match the other information that has been provided, then buyer has the option to terminate. So here we are 10 days prior to closing. Seller provides the information. Buyer says, that doesn't match what you told me before. Buyer has 5 days to examine that. So now we're 5 days prior to closing. Buyer can terminate. So yeah, something to watch for if you have tenant occupied property, because you could be 5 days away from closing and buyer could terminate on that basis.
You want to get that.
Except you want it to be current, right? So the comment was you want to get it when you list it, but it's an estoppel letter and you want it to be current before closing, just like the HOA estoppel letter and the lender's estoppel letter, you know? So yeah, that would be ideal, but it may not be valid by the time you get to closing. I think that's the concern there. Our next one is force majeure. So we had a lot of questions over the past year about force majeure. Force majeure used to be called acts of God. All kinds of things can be force majeure, extreme weather, on and on and on, right? So what this says is we're going to extend all of the time periods in the contract up to 7 days after the end of the force majeure and we've restored services. Does that make sense? So let's say the storm hits and it knocks out all the electrical systems for the grid is down for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, the grid is back up. We have 7 days from that date to get back on track with our contract. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not just 7 days after the event, it's 7 days after the restoration of our services. Up to 30 days. We're not going to do it indefinitely. If it's day 30 and boom, everything is back up and running, we're all good, we're back on track. If it's day 31, the parties have the option to terminate. And this is at line 433. Then either party may terminate by delivering notice to the other. So we're not going to let it go on indefinitely. All right. Next is escrow closing, and you're likely never to see this. This has to do with if the title insurance doesn't include gap coverage. And gap coverage is coverage for the time between when they last updated the title report and when they get the documents recorded. That's the gap. And there's a lot that can happen in the gap depending on how long it takes, right? So if there is no gap coverage, we're going to close it in escrow, which means that all of the funds are going to be held. We're not going to disperse anything we're going to give the buyer 10 days after closing within which to satisfy themselves that nothing has happened to title. And after that 10-day period, if the buyer hasn't objected, then we're going to go, okay, we're closed and funds are dispersed, everything is good. If within that 10-day period, something horrible has happened, like a new mortgage got recorded that the buyer knew nothing about, that the seller had done, or a lien, or somebody else claims title to the property, anything affecting title, then the buyer could go, nope, title is no good. Let's just pretend this never happened. So the buyer would reconvey the property to the seller, all the funds would go back to the lender, and we just go on and pretend we didn't have a transaction. And so the contract would terminate, obviously.
So that's if the title issue
If-
did not provide insurance
If
against adverse matter.
if there's no coverage in the gap. And nowadays, you're almost always going to have coverage in the gap. It's just like in the, that first decade of the 2000s, there were a lot of policies issued without gap coverage. So when I was doing title claims, that was the issue on a lot of things, that a lot can happen in that gap. And so now we have gap coverage. Pretty much universally, I would guess. So that's why you probably will never come across this. Okay, and our next one is right here, risk of loss. So imagine the storm comes, and I hate to talk about all this like horrible stuff, but the storm comes and the house is damaged, and the damage exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price. Then the buyer has the option of taking that amount as a credit or terminating the contract. Okay, and this is at the top of page 10. It says, if the cost of restoration exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price, this is line 499, buyer shall elect to take the property as is, together with that amount as a refund as a credit, right? They get that amount to restore the property. So there would probably be an assignment of insurance benefits that we're talking about, that the buyer would get that amount, or the buyer can terminate the contract. Because, if it's 1.5% of the purchase price, then we may get into issues with, is the lender going to approve the loan? Yeah, that kind of stuff, right? So that is the last of our stuff from the contracts, and we're going to fly through the addenda. How's that sound? Okay, so the first one is condo rider, and there are 4 ways to leave at this point. I know, I won't go into detail. The first one is the condominium association approval. If they don't approve the buyer, we're not going to make the buyer buy, so the contract terminates. The next one is the association has the right of first refusal. If the association has the option to purchase the property and they exercise that option, the contract terminates. I've actually worked with people where that has happened. Yeah. And sometimes the documents allow the individual members the right of first refusal. If the members exercise that option, the contract terminates because they have first rights, right? And the next one is if the buyer receives the documents, I should say when the buyer receives the documents that are required by statute. And this is in paragraph 5 right here at B. It says the contract is voidable by the buyer within 3 business days. Now, it doesn't say business days, but read what it says, within 3 days, excluding Saturdays, Sundays, legal holiday. What is that? That's a business day, right? So the buyer has 3 business days after they receive all the condo docs to review and decide yes or no. And I've seen that happen up to the day before closing because there was a delay in getting the most current versions to the buyer. The buyer finally got them and they terminated, and they were well within their rights to do so because they have 3 business days all the way up until closing. From the day they got the documents, exactly. That's when the day starts. So the next one is HOA disclosure. And this says, this is right out of the statute. If this is required, then the contract is voidable, again, voidable within 3 days. Now, this is different. It's not 3 business days. It's just 3 days after receipt of this disclosure. And the disclosure means this addendum. So that's why you want to make sure it's delivered at the time of the contract, right? At least they should see it beforehand, but they should definitely see it at the time of the contract, not a week later. And I've seen that happen. Whenever the buyer receives this from the time of the signing the contract on, and then for 3 days after they receive this addendum, the buyer has the right to terminate the contract.
What if it's a voluntary?
If it's voluntary, that's different. Good question. So the question is if it's voluntary. No, this is for mandatory, right? So that's when this is required. Mandatory. Okay, if it's voluntary, then it's entirely voluntary whether the seller even provides this. All right, next one is assumption of existing mortgage. Oh, sorry. We don't have any outs in seller financing. The next one is assumption of existing mortgage. If the lender doesn't approve the buyer for the assumption, contract terminates. We're not going to make the buyer buy if the lender has not approved them. Okay, that makes sense, right? Next one is FHA VA addendum. And so the first opportunity is if we're FHA and the appraisal comes in less than the amount that's specified in the addendum. So it says the purchaser shall have the privilege and option of proceeding, but they don't have to, right? They don't have to. They have the option not to. So they can terminate, and we'll see how that works. And then the next one is in paragraph 3B, appraisal repairs. If the cost of appraisal repairs exceeds the limit that we've put in paragraph 2, then seller has 3 days to give notice to say I'm paying all, some, or none. And if the seller is not paying all, then the buyer can elect to pay the balance, and the buyer has 3 days to make that election. So presumably, if the buyer doesn't elect to pay the balance, the buyer can terminate. And then we have very similar provisions for a VA. And so it says if the reasonable value, that means the appraised value, right? Different terminology for VA. If it's not more than what we've specified as the reasonable value, right? Then the purchaser has the privilege and option of proceeding, which means they don't have to, right? It's an option of proceeding. So that means that they could terminate based on the appraisal that comes back for VA. And then we have very similar provision for the appraisal repairs. If the repairs are more than what we've said in paragraph 2, and the seller gives the notice, I pay all, some, or none, and then the buyer can choose to pay the excess. If they don't, then presumably they can terminate. So in paragraph 5, we talk about how the buyer can make the election to proceed with the contract. And the buyer needs to give notice within 3 days after they get the appraisal, right? And that's how the buyer elects to proceed with the contract. Make sense? All right, next is the appraisal contingency. Clearly, this one is pretty straightforward. By the way, I've had so many calls recently. There is no appraisal contingency in the contract. There's that appraisal language that we talked about that protects the lender. That's not a contingency that protects the buyer. This is the contingency that protects the buyer. So what it says is we want an appraisal on or before a certain date with an appraisal at or above a certain value. And if we don't get it, then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. There's nothing in here that says that the parties must negotiate the purchase price. They don't have to. They could say it came in low and we're done. And those are really the only options. The buyer has the option to proceed or terminate. In reality, they usually do try to negotiate, but they're not required to. Short sale, we have 3 ways in here. The first one is that we missed the short sale approval deadline. You know, the lender doesn't approve the short sale within the time period that we've said. The next one is that the contract shall automatically terminate if the seller has not delivered the notice within 30 days after the expiration of the time period. So the time period can get elongated and we haven't met those time periods and the contract terminates, or the lender can not approve the short sale. So they're similar, but not quite the same. Okay, so those are 2 ways. And then the third way is the lender forecloses before we get the short sale done. And that could happen, right? They have all these big departments and they're working and they're not talking to each other. And it's just a matter of who gets there first. Is it the foreclosure department or is it the short sale department? If the foreclosure department wins, then no more contract, right? Because the seller doesn't own it anymore. All right, I'm going to change my screen here and continue with the share. And we're going to start with H, which is homeowners flood insurance. And these are exactly the same, really. So if the buyer is unable to obtain a certain premium, first year premium, that's all we care about, for homeowners insurance or flood insurance, or both, whichever ones we specify. If it's more than the amount that we've specified in the addendum, then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. And I know people want to avoid putting a lot of addenda onto the contracts because offers are so hard to get accepted these days. However, the insurance market is changing dramatically, and this could really benefit buyers who are going to be very unpleasantly surprised by how much insurance costs. So that's something to consider. It may be of benefit to buyers. All right, the next one is the as is. So we talked about this one. Remember, the as is addendum turns the standard contract into an as is contract. So it's kind of a little bit of a let's sneak it in anyway, right? So we have the standard contract, seller counters with the as is, and now we've changed it into an as is. And suddenly the buyer has that absolute right to terminate within the inspection period. So that's how that one works. And it's at paragraph 2, right here, C, if buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion, right? Same language that we have in paragraph 12 of the as is. Next one is right to inspect, right to cancel. So this turns the standard contract into a hybrid between the as is and the standard. And what this says is within the inspection period, the buyer has the absolute right to terminate the contract. If the buyer doesn't terminate the contract, then all those repair provisions kick in that we have in the standard. So again, kind of a let's sneak it in, but that's one more way that buyer could terminate. Yes.
So the as is addendum will not let you fix it and do all the things. This one will be like
Yes.
the best of both worlds.
Exactly. Yeah. So what she was saying is it's the best of both worlds when you use the right to inspect, right to cancel. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, defective drywall. So we all know about defective drywall, right? And so we're going to specify a repair amount specifically for drywall. And if the buyer uses this addendum, buyer does inspections, finds defective drywall, the repairs are more than the specified amount. The default is $500. You're not going to get anywhere for $500 if you're trying to fix drywall, right? Whether it's defective or not. If it's more than the specified amount, then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. Okay, next, we don't, oh, shoot, sorry. I didn't mean to stop share. I meant to move to the next addendum. Okay. Was there a question? Okay, so I'm gonna do a new share and get to the next ones where we actually have a contingency. And we're jumping all the way to addendum R, which is the rezoning. And the rezoning is where the buyer has plans for the property that require rezoning of the property. So whatever the plans are, they're not consistent with the current zoning designation. And the buyer only wants to buy the property if they can get it rezoned. So that's when you would use this. If they're not able to get the rezoning within the time periods, then the contract terminates. I don't think I've ever seen this one used. I mean, I can imagine all kinds of uses for it, but I don't think I've ever seen it used actually. The next one is lease purchase lease option. So everybody understands the difference between a purchase and an option. And I apologize, I went to a different tab by accident. Okay, so lease purchase is I'm going to rent the property, and sometime within that rental period or when it ends, then I'm definitely buying it, right? That's the lease purchase. The lease option is I'm going to rent the property, and sometime within that period, or maybe at the end of it, I have the option to buy it, but I don't have to. So that's the difference. However, we handle each of them in the same way. And what it says is the parties are going to go to the lawyers, they're going to get all the documents drawn up, and we even specify who's going to pay for it, you know, buyer, seller, or 50-50. And this is interesting. Can everybody see the screen there? Let me move this so you can see the screen better. So at the bottom, it says, if those documents are not executed within the time stated, this contract shall be terminated. That sounds like it's an automatic termination. It's not the buyer or the seller has the option. It's terminated, right? And look at the time period. It's 5 days after the effective date. You can't get in to see a lawyer within 5 days, much less come to terms on a complicated agreement like this, right? So if you use this addendum, make sure you change that time deadline to make sense for the real world. Yeah, I mean, unless you've got somebody on speed dial, you're not going to be able to talk to anybody in 5 days. That's just the reality of it. Okay, next one, and I know we're getting close to time and we're almost done. In fact, I guess we're a couple minutes over. I apologize. And they're companions, T and U. T is pre-closing occupancy by buyer. U is post-closing occupancy by seller. They're very similar. In the pre-closing, it says within 10 days after the effective date, we're going to go to the lawyer. We're going to specify who pays, buyer, seller, split it equally. And we're going to come up with this fabulous pre-occupancy lease. If we don't, then it says either party may terminate the contract. That's that second paragraph there. Either party may terminate the contract. Now, again, 10 days may be optimistic to think you can get in that quickly. Yeah. And so good point. Someone said, so long as the buyer hasn't already taken occupancy. If the buyer already has taken occupancy, then that changes everything. All right, so post-closing occupancy by seller. Same thing, only we're counting backward from the closing date rather than forward from the effective date. And it says within 10 days prior to closing, then they're going to get everything drawn up. If they don't come to terms on it, then either may terminate the contract. Wow. We're close to closing, right? And we've terminated because they couldn't come to terms on the lease. Yeah. So use these when they're appropriate, but try to avoid situations where you have pre or post occupancy, right? Yes, absolutely. Try to avoid them. They never turn out well. Rarely, I should say, rarely. Sale of buyer's property. So this one, very straightforward. The current contract is contingent on the sale of the buyer's existing property. And if we don't sell it by a certain date, then within 3 days after that date, buyer has the option to terminate the contract, right? And I see a lot of these where the date they put is the date of closing. Logistically, in the real world, it makes sense because you want the closings to coincide. However, in terms of how this addendum works, it doesn't make sense because if the buyer's property doesn't close, then they have 3 days to terminate. And imagine you're days before closing and the buyer has the right to terminate. So that could be confusing for a lot of people, I should say. Backup contract. So this is exactly what it sounds like. They're all self-explanatory, right? So there's already a contract on a property and the buyer is still interested. The buyer wants to be considered as a backup in case something happens to that primary contract. And so we're going to put an absolute expiration date and time. This is the only place where we see them specify a time. Do you see it? It says 5 p.m. on blank. So we have a date and a time for expiration of this backup. It says contract is really an offer, right? And so if we don't hear back from the seller before 5 p.m. on that date, then this expires and it just goes away all on its own. And we're no longer a backup.
And you sign the entire contract, including this addendum.
Yeah,
By both parties.
yeah. Or the seller could wait until they put you in first position and then sign everything and send it back to you. And as soon as you get that notice, then you know that you're in first position.
So we don't have to sign. You can just sit in a drawer.
It would be ideal. That way you know for sure. However, there could be some confusion if they go ahead and sign everything. It's like, oh my gosh, are we in 2 contracts? Yeah. And so I think it would be, as long as everyone has agreed on the terms and everyone is good and we have the backup addendum, then the seller could theoretically sign at the point where they put you into first position. Up until that moment, that 5 p.m. on that specified date, the buyer can always withdraw the offer. They could go, yeah, we don't want to be in backup anymore. They're not required to leave it there until the expiration, but they can if they want to. Next one is kick-out clause. So this is harsh. I always tell people it's so harsh. And you heard my name for it probably because I did the addendum class, right? I came to the party with you, but I might be leaving with somebody else. So what this says is, okay, I'm going to accept your offer. However, I really think something better is going to come along. And so when something better comes along, I'm going to tell you that I have this backup contract and you have X number of days, and it says 3, to put more money into escrow and waive contingencies. How many buyers can waive all those contingencies? It says contingencies for the sale of your home, contingency for financing. Most people need the financing to buy the next property. Most people need to sell their current property to get the financing to buy the next property. So that's essentially like, yeah, I'm not going to respond to you. And if I don't respond, if I as the buyer don't respond, then the contract terminates.
Since it says financing, does that include appraisal?
Yeah. Oh,
Appraisal?
no, sorry. If you have the separate appraisal contingency addendum, it would survive because the contingency for financing would refer to paragraph 8B in the contract. Yeah. Okay, the next 2 are companions: seller's attorney approval, buyer's attorney approval. And so we specify a date by which we want to get that lawyer's approval. And if we don't get approval by that date, then that party may terminate. You see, it says may terminate. And for the seller, it says may terminate. So it's not an automatic termination. The buyer could get their letter back from their lawyer and the lawyer says, oh, this contract is awful. And here's why. And the buyer goes, I don't care. I love the property. I'm going to buy it anyway. And so you know, they have the option to terminate, but they're not required to terminate based on attorney approval. And remember, I always say this, but it's so important. Approval is different from review. And I've seen so many people write in paragraph 20 additional terms. This contract is contingent on review by buyer's attorney or seller's attorney. Review does not mean approve, and they can review it all day long and we don't care. If they don't have the right of approval, it means nothing, right? And so a lot of agents have done a disservice to their clients and customers by writing that. Use the addendum if there's one for your situation. And that is it. We have done our 48 ways to leave our contract. Any questions? I know it was kind of a whirlwind. So any questions, any concerns, anything you didn't know that you learned?
I'm amazed about the acceptance. That's just the first. So if the person put the acceptance date for tomorrow at 12, and you don't answer by 1 p.m. or something like that, it just gets dropped.
Yeah.
Oh, anytime before the end of the year.
Well, what she's saying, if the time for acceptance has passed, then I, as the buyer, don't have to
No.
continue to play.
Right.
Yeah, I can just move on. I can say you didn't get back to me in time.
So is the best practice there to change that? If the acceptance is after that date? to change
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Even if there's been counters in between? because
So,
it says
yeah,
counters
so-
extended for 2 days.
right. So here's the question. If we're in active negotiations and we're continuing to negotiate, do we need to change that time for the acceptance? Because the contract already allows us 2 days to respond to a counter offer. And I would say no, because we're still within the requirements of the contract. In your situation though, where the time for acceptance has expired and now the seller is coming and saying, here's the accepted contract, I would say, yes, change the time for the acceptance.
And
Do-
initial-
Yeah,
initial understanding.
yes. So it really is going to be very fact specific about whether you should change that time for acceptance. If you've been within all the time periods that the contract says with counter offers and back and forth, you know, that's like a tennis game, you know, that's fine because you're doing what the contract says. And I would say there's no need to change the time for acceptance. But if the situation is the time for acceptance has expired without any interaction from the seller, and now suddenly the seller is showing up and is back in the game, then I would say, yes, change that time for the acceptance so that all parties are clear on what happened.
Can you go back
Date
to
would you put in?
the financing part of the contract
Mhm.
and where it talks about the appraisal in there
Yeah,
and why there is no out for the buyer? If the appraisal is done late.
done late.
If the appraisal is done late and it's low.
Okay, okay.
Is there a deadline? I thought it said that the appraisal can come after.
So the question is the language in paragraph 8 about loan approval and based on appraisal. So here's what it says. And we're looking at paragraph of Roman numeral 7, and then it's line 116. So it says, if loan approval has been obtained, so we got loan approval, right? Lender said, yay, loan approval, or deemed obtained because we didn't give the right notice and the seller didn't terminate.
Right.
And the buyer fails to close because, and we're skipping down to subparagraph 3 at line 119, appraisal of the property is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. So the appraisal comes in way low and it doesn't meet the lender's underwriting guidelines.
then the buyer can get out.
then the lender basically is denying the loan after they've already given loan approval, right? And we're gonna let the buyer get the deposit back. Yeah.
We have an agent who was having trouble with that, where the loan approval period was passed. And
Mhm.
I don't know whether they did their notices or not, but
Yeah.
he knew the party had canceled.
Yeah,
And then finally the appraisal was done and it came in quite low.
yeah,
And the buyer wants to cancel. Now the seller wants part of their deposit because they took all the furniture out of the house.
yeah. And it's not up to the buyer to cancel. The lender needs to deny the loan.
Okay,
Yeah. Buyer fails to close this contract unless the failure is due to the appraisal is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. So this is when the lender says, I'm sorry, I know we said yes, but based on this appraisal, we're saying no. So it's not up to the buyer, it's up to the lender. Because I've seen lots of times the appraisal comes in low and the lender's going, yeah, we're still gonna lend because we've still got sufficient loan to value ratios and we're still saying yes. And then the buyer has no right to terminate. The buyer needs to come up with that additional cash.
So basically, it's telling you there that the only person that can say that no, you're not approved is the lender.
Mhm.
So if you want
In this instance, yes.
to be extremely contingent to the appraisal, you need to add that addendum,
Yes.
because then you are not waiting for the mortgage people to
Right.
deny it. It's,
Mhm.
if for you, it doesn't have the value, you can just drop it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the difference between both.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the observation is the way to really protect your buyer for appraisal issues is to use that appraisal contingency addendum, because then it's up to the buyer to decide. This instance in the contract, it's up to the lender to decide. So this language protects the lender. It does not protect the buyer. The contingency addendum protects the buyer.
so if the buyer, for instance, were only getting 50% financing and it came in 20% low, the lender
Mhm.
doesn't care.
Yeah.
So that's still what it's through.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, again, the comment is buyers getting 50% financing, appraisal comes in 20% low. The lender's still gonna approve the loan and the buyer needs to come up with the difference. Yeah. So, and similar issue, I was talking with an agent a couple of weeks ago and the buyer was putting $100,000 down and so it was just slightly less than 50%. And the appraisal came in low and the lender's going, yeah, we know it's a little bit low, but you're still good. We're still, and yeah. And so the buyer needed to come up with that additional money.
I have a
Oh.
question.
Yes.
So if it does, if you are the listing agent and your buyer agent says they can't get the loan, can you as a listing agent ask for a letter or some type of written thing that proves that they can't actually get the loan?
Yeah, you can ask for proof that they didn't get the loan. And usually the lender is going to be able to provide something. I mean, you can, as the listing agent, you have the right to be in contact with the lender.
Right.
The contract says that the buyer authorizes the lender to release information to you, to the buyer's own agent. Yeah, so you can get information. The contract also says that the buyer will work diligently in good faith to get approval. So I've heard instances where the buyer kind of changed their mind and they're like, well, I just won't get loan approval. Guess what? That's a condition of default. You can't just sit back and wait for denial to happen. Yeah. Yeah.
Elliot, I have two questions that they may be dumb, but the one is like for the wood destroying organism clause where either party can can cancel or terminate.
Mhm.
Why would a seller in that instance want to terminate?
I really can't think of a reason why they would, because, maybe they just decide that, gosh, I committed myself to spending 3% of the purchase price, or even 1.5% of the purchase price, and now I don't think I want to do it. So, that might be a reason why they would terminate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't understand. I figured if there was a reason that specifically says that either party can do it, I was trying to figure out why that would be.
Right.
And the other thing is, where you said to change that number for the, what was, the lease, you were negotiating the lease terms and you said you could never do that in 5 days. Is
Mhm.
there a number, like, is there how long would you allow for that?
So I would say 15 days, and I'm being kind of optimistic there, just because I know and granted, this is in the Kansas City area, and my daughter-in-law's mother passed away recently, and so she is the trustee of the trust, and she had to schedule an appointment with the lawyers. Well, it's taking her 2 weeks to get in to see a lawyer for a first appointment. And imagine if she had to, scramble to get something actually done within a certain time period. I know, when I talk to friends of mine, other lawyers, and they're just like, gosh, I'm so busy, and, trying to schedule appointments, I'm several weeks out. And so I would say 15 days. And again, I think that's being optimistic, to think that you can get in to see somebody and get something accomplished. But it's really up to the parties and what they can come to terms on.
Is there a safe number? I mean, you said that that's kind of like do you think that, I like a safe, but agreeable number?
So I would suggest start with that and see if the parties can come to terms on 15 days. And then if it looks like it's not doable, you can always extend the time period. The parties can always agree to extend the time period if they need to.
Okay, and then one other thing. So it's okay to change that. Do all the parties have to initial where you would change, like cross out that 5 and put in 15? Do the parties then initial right there? Or do
Yes,
they, yes, okay,
yes, yeah, you would want everybody to initial the change.
okay. And then that's where they do it, right at the change.
Yes,
Okay, all right, thank you.
yes. Any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you all for being here. I hope it was valuable to you. If you have any questions, just call me, text me, email me. And,
Very valuable.
oh, good, thank you, thank you. And I will hopefully see you all again soon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye, everybody.
Bye.